Hi and welcome back to this series. Now, in the last parts of this series, we started working on our React.js frontend for our GraphQL backend. And this is taking shape, but thus far we haven't added any code that would actually interact with our GraphQL API. And that is exactly what we'll do in this video here, because now we will finally start to add some authentication logic so that we can use our GraphQL endpoints for creating users and for logging users in. So let's go to our auth page in our React app here, and let's build a sign up and login form, because that sounds like a good start if we want to send the respective requests to the backend. So I'll add a form element there, and in that form I'll add a div with maybe a class form control, which we can use for styling if we wish to do so. So let's quickly add that here. And inside of that div, I will add a label, and that label will be for my email address, which I want to get. So the text will be email, and below that I want to have an input, and that input will be of type email and will get the ID email. And for here needs to be changed to HTML4, which is the React attribute or property for the for attribute in HTML, because for is a keyword in JavaScript. We have to use that. Okay, so now we got that input, we got that label. Let's now copy that and also create a password field here, also of type password, to hide the characters. Here that has some text of password, and below that I want to have two buttons actually. One which allows me to toggle between sign up and login, and the other one which actually submits the form. So here I'll add another div with maybe a class name of form actions, and in there I want to have my buttons. The first button will be of type button, so that this button does not trigger the surrounding form element and does not submit the form. And that will be my switch to, let's say, sign up, and we will set this text dynamically soon button. And the other button, well, that will be a button of type submit, which should actually trigger the submit event on our form here. And therefore I will also say submit on the button. Now, if we save that, we'll see our page update and we get this ugly form here. Now, speaking of ugly, I think you can't really see authenticate. Now, that is something we set up in the last video. Now, I will change this. I'm not happy with that. Maybe a little bit of a brighter yellow whitish color is better here. And of course, you can choose a different styling. You can underline that. You can change the background, whatever you want. Now, back to that form here, however, I want to style that form a little bit too. And for that, I'll add a new file here of CSS, and there I will select my overall form element, or I could do that. I'll actually not do this. I'll add a class here, auth form, so that I don't style all form elements on my page. Instead, I'll give this a class of auth form here, and now I can style that. For that to have an effect, I need to import my style sheet here, of course, so that these styles get added. And now here, I want to give that a width of, let's say, 40 rem and a max width of 80% of the page width. I want to center it in the middle with margin auto left and right, top and bottom, let's say 2 rem to have some distance to the header and so on. Actually, let's bump this up to 5 rem here. Looks a bit better. And now, remember, I added these form control class names here, which surround my labels and my inputs. Well, I'll take these. I'll control or take access or control over my form control here. And I want to style both my labels and also my inputs in there and give them a width of 100% and change them to display block so that they take the full available width they can get. And now that form is actually a little bit too big. Let's change that to 25 rem here. Yeah, that looks better. So now I got that set up. Now some distance between these form controls would be nice too. So for each form control, I'll add a margin to the bottom, so margin bottom of, let's say, 1 rem, so that there's some distance between these blocks of input elements. Maybe we also want to give our form control label some margin to the bottom, so that there is some distance between the label and the actual input of .5 rem. Yeah, like that. And now let's also make sure these buttons look good. First of all, I'll actually switch their order so that the submit button comes first. And then I want to style my buttons here. Form actions, select the button in there. And the button in my form action should have a background color, which is, let's say, in that bluish color I also used here. So this light blue color. This is the background color. The font should be inherited so that it takes the same font family and a default font size as the rest of the page, or actually the parent element, but therefore also the rest of the page here has. Don't forget the hashtag here. Let's give it a border of 1 pixel solid and that same bluish color. And maybe give it rounded corners here like this, so that it looks like that. Now, to enhance this look a little bit, let's add some padding. Left and right, top and bottom, let's say 0.5 rem, left and right 1 rem maybe. Let's also add some margin to the left and right of 1 rem for these buttons. A little bit less padding top and bottom, 0.25. Now, I don't want to have a margin for to the very left here for this button. So what I'll actually do is I'll change this and give them a margin to the right of 1 rem, so that there is no margin to the left. And to make them a little bit prettier, I will also, first of all, change that border radius to 3 pixels and give them a box shadow of 1 pixel, 1 pixel, 5 pixels, and then a transparent black color so that they'll look a little bit more like buttons. And last but not least, we could give them some white text if we wanted to. So a color of white, which will style the text appropriately, though that is up to you if you want to do that. Could be a bit hard to read, but I'll go with that. And let's now also add a cursor pointer to indicate that they are clickable when we hover over them, because our mouse now changes. Now, obviously, we want to have some hover effect too, probably. So let's actually add a hover and also an active style, so that both whilst the button is getting pressed, as well as when we're hovering over it, it changes its style. And there I'll start with the background I have, but maybe make that a bit darker when we hover over it, something like that. And the same for the border color. I want to have the same border color so that we see no difference between border and background. Yeah, and now I guess it's clear that we can push these buttons. Now, obviously, as always, change this to your likings, change the colors, whatever you want. I now want to send a request to my backend. And for that, we need to start our backend server. Now, before we go there and run npm start, there are 2 important things to keep in mind. The first thing you have to keep in mind is that your front-end development server needs to keep on running, because we have that separation of servers. We have our backend API server, which we could host on a totally different server than our built React app in the end. And therefore, we need to keep this front-end server process running. And the second important part related to that is that our React app runs on port 3000 by default, and that is also the port I used for the front-end in the past. Now I will change this to 8000 so that we don't clash here, because we can't run both on the same port, obviously. And with that, I will open a new terminal with the old process, the front-end server, still running in a different terminal. And in that new terminal, I navigate into the main project folder, so not in the front-end folder, but the whole project folder, and run npm start there to bring up the Node server with that new port. And now we have that backend running, we got the frontend running, now we can start sending requests. Now let's briefly have a look at our schema here to see which requests we can send. And I want to start with a request to that create user endpoint, so that we can create a new user, which makes sense as a first step, I guess. So for this, let's go back into the auth.js file. because there we added all the styling, but we got no logic in there. We got these two buttons, but these buttons don't do anything. Now, let's make sure they do something by also gathering our inputs here when we press the submit button. So here in this auth page component, I will add a new method here, submit handler, the name is up to you, which I'll create like this. And in this method here, I want to read the email and the password and send it to the backend basically. And we'll add login logic later. Now, to get these values, we could use two approaches. The first approach is that we set up two-way binding. So we basically start managing state here, and then we bind the values of our inputs to that state and listen to the change event on that. That's a typical pattern you see a lot. But we can also use refs, references, and I'll do that. For that, I'll add the constructor, which receives props and which needs to call super props first. And then I can set up two references here with the ref API, which is built into React. The first reference will be stored in a class property, which I'll name email L, because the reference will be to the full element, not just to the value we entered. And this can be created by calling React create ref here. Now, the second reference will be my password L, my password element, and I also create that with create React ref and create ref. And these are two different references stored in two different properties. Now, they aren't useful in these properties. We need to connect them to the DOM elements or to the JSX elements. And we do that with the special ref property, which React knows. And for the email input, I'll bind that to this email L. And for the password, I'll bind it to this password L. So now that is connected, and now we can access these references and therefore the elements at which they point anywhere in this component. And I want to use these references here in the submit handler. So in the submit handler, we can now start reading these values. For example, from the email L, there we have a current prop that is given to us by React, and that current prop will now be referring to the actual element. And there we can, since we know that it is an input element, we can get the value. And the same for the password. We can access this password L current value like this. Now, what we want to do, of course, is we want to validate that the user did enter a valid or at least some email and some password. Now, I'll not add full validation here. We could do that. We could check if the password, if the email is a valid email address. We could also mark the input with a red border if it's wrong. Feel free to do that. I want to send a request here. So I will actually do a very simple validation. I will trim the email value to remove any excess white space at the beginning and end, and then check if the length is equal to 0, which means it's empty. And if that is the case, or if the same is the case for the password, so if I trim that and the length is equal to 0, then we have either no email or no password, or both. And then I just want to return. I will not continue. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check, we have an email and we have a password. So in that case, I want to send a request to the backend here. Now, for the moment, let's console log email and password to confirm that this works. And let's now connect the submit handler to our form. And for that, on that whole form element, I will listen to the onSubmit event and bind this submit handler. And thanks to the way I wrote this method with this arrow function notation, I don't need to bind this or anything like this. This keyword in this method will always refer to the class because I'm using the arrow function notation here. Now with that, the submit event is bound to the form. Because this button here is of type submit, this event will actually be triggered. There's one last thing I want to do. When this gets submitted, the default behavior of the browser will be to actually send a request to the same URL this page is running on. So it would send a request to our development server, which of course will not achieve anything. I want to prevent that default from happening. And we can do this with the event object we get when the submit event occurs. This event object is passed into this method, which we bound here, or which we bound here with its reference being shared here. automatically. So we actually can expect the event object here as an argument. And the first thing I want to do here is I want to call prevent default to make sure that no request gets sent. Now with that, if we save all of that, let me open up the developer tools here and bring up that console so that we can see any output. And now let's enter test@test.com and here maybe tester and submit this. And we see it here. This is the input I just entered. If I click switch to sign up, we don't see anything because this does not trigger the submit event, as it shouldn't. But we can hit that and you see that count go up. So we can catch these values. Now, of course, we want to not just output them here. We want to send a request. And for that, I'll use the fetch API here, though you could also use Axios or any other library for sending HTTP requests in React apps. I'll use the fetch API, which is built into modern browsers. Now there we need to pass the URL, and the name kind of implies that you can use this method to, well, fetch data. Turns out you can not just do that, you can also use it to send data, and that is, of course, what we will do here. Now, the URL we'll send to is localhost 8000/GraphQL. Remember, that is on the front end, that is our endpoint, which we have here. So that is the URL to which I want to send the request. But we need to configure that request because by default, it will be a GET request and it doesn't hold any data. It will have the wrong headers. Now, we can pass a JavaScript object to this fetch method as a second argument to now configure that request. And there we can set the method, and we need to set it to post, of course, because GraphQL works with post. We'll also need to set a body, and I'll come back to this in a second. I first of all want to set up the headers though, because that is easy to overlook, and it will make sure that this fails if we do it incorrectly. For our GraphQL server on the backend to work, we need to tell that server in which format we're sending the request. And I will send it in JSON format, so a string which in the end contains a JavaScript object which will describe my GraphQL query. And I'll show you that object and that data in a second. Therefore, I need to let the backend know that I'm sending JSON data. And for that, I'll add the content type header with the value of application JSON. And this will make sure that the backend tries to parse the incoming data as JSON. And it will be our GraphQL endpoint which does this. Now, important, this will fail still, and I will show you why and fix it soon. But first of all, let's go back to the front end here, and let's work on that body. I will prepare it here. It's essentially our query or our request, request body, whatever you want to call it. And that is generally a JavaScript object, which we will stringify into JSON format. So we pass request body, this object here, into JSON stringify to turn it into the right format. Now, of course, we don't send an empty object, but this object can have a couple of fields. For example, it must have a query field. And that will hold as a value a string. And I'll use backticks here so that I can write a multi-line string. Now, in this string, we put our GraphQL query syntax. So if we're sending a mutation, we write mutation here. Then we can give this any name we want or leave it out. And now in the curly braces, we target a specific endpoint like create user. So that's what I'll do here. I'll send this to create user. And in there, we need to pass in some arguments, of course. We have our user input, to be precise, right? We can see that here, user input. And that is essentially an object with email and password. So let's add a colon here, and then the curly braces. And then we'll have email and password as fields here. And now important, the email needs to be passed between double quotes because it must be a string, and therefore it has to be a string here too. And so we do have to do it for the password. Now, since I use backticks here, we can dynamically inject the value. And I'll show a more elegant way of doing that soon, but for now I'll do it like this. We can inject the value with that string literal injection syntax. And I can pass my email here. And for the password between the double quotes, I can pass the password like this. Now, as we know by our schema, for the create user here, we get back a user object. And that user object has an ID, email, and so on. So I actually want to get some of that data. So I add opening and closing curly braces, and then I want to get that ID and that email, let's say. Now this would be valid GraphQL syntax, and we put that in our query property here. Now we can send this request and we can simply see if that works. So let's go there. Let's enter some dummy data here. And make sure, by the way, that you clean up your backend database and purge all the data we played around with so that we can really create new users and you don't fail because you try to create users which already exist. So clear your existing database first. And once you did this, hit submit. And you should get an error here. And you'll get a course error, to be precise. You get an error that the request has been blocked by course policy. And this is actually a security mechanism built into modern browsers. They basically check for these behind-the-scenes requests, AJAX requests and the fetch API, whether the server to which you're sending the request, if it's not the same server as you're currently on this page, so if it's not localhost 3000, if that server allows cross-origin requests. And our server doesn't allow that at the moment, because how do we allow it? By setting the right headers, and we're not setting such headers on our server at the moment. So that is something which we'll have to change, and that is exactly what I'll do now. In the app.js file, before we even run our isAuth middleware, I'll add a new middleware here with a normal Express.js middleware function which gets the request and response objects and that next function. And in there, I want to add some headers to every response that is sent back by our server. Because for this server, I want to allow cross-origin requests. That's basically the case for every API you're building, unless you are sure that you have an API which you only want to consume from the same host. Now, I therefore want to set a new header, which has to be access-control-allow-origin. And the value for this header will be a star. And this means every host, every client location can send requests to this server. Now, this is not enough. We need to set another header too, which is access control allow methods, because we're granting access basically to every client location, every client domain. But now I want to control which kind of requests can you send. And there I want to allow post and get requests and options, because turns out the browser will also automatically send an options request before it sends a post request. And that's a default behavior of the browser, where it basically looks whether the post request it is about to send is allowed by the server. And therefore, it sends this options request first automatically. So we need to allow that too. Now, there's one last header which I want to set, and that's the access-control-allow-headers, which controls which kind of headers we can set for the requests we're sending to that server. And there, I want to allow the content type header, which we are already adding, and the authorization header, which we'll soon need. So now we can send these types of requests. Now there's one special case which I want to handle, and that is when the request method is equal to options. Then we have this automatically sent request. This, however, should not reach our GraphQL API because it can't be handled there correctly. So for such options requests, I don't want to let this request continue on my server. I just want to return a response where I send a status of 200, where I basically signal to the client, it's okay, you can send your whatever you wanted to send, your post request in our case, you're good. Otherwise, if we don't go into this if statement, I'll call next so that the request can continue its journey. And now if we save that and therefore our backend server restarts, we don't even need to reload the front end. If I just hit submit again, this now doesn't fail. You see, there is no error being thrown there. But we also don't see any other output. If we go to the network tab, however, we can see requests here. Let me increase that a little bit. We see there is a request which was sent to GraphQL, a fetch request here, as you can see. And if we click on that, we see we got back a user, data, create user, with the email and the ID. So that seemed to have succeeded. So that request was successful. If we have a look at the headers at the very bottom, we also see our request body, which we attached, which is our query. So this is working. Now, of course, right now we're not doing super much with that information on the front end. One thing I want to do at least is I want to print the response, and fetch actually returns a promise, so we can use then and catch. Now, if we have an error here, and by the way, that is not an error thrown by the backend, so not something like a non-200 status code, but more things like network issues, then I also want to log that error. We could show an alert and a modal, but I just want to do that. If we get back a response, however, then this will be interesting to look at. I'll check if the response has a status which is not equal to 200 and which is not equal to 201. And in that case, I will now throw a new error, failed. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check, we have a successful response. And therefore, I will now return response JSON, which is a method I can call on this response object given to me by the fetch API. And this will automatically extract and parse the response body, so that in the next then block, I'll have my response data, basically, which I can now log here, like this. Okay, so now if I save this, let's try it again. And let's first of all try it again for the credentials which I just used, which now should be taken. Let's open the console and click Submit. And what we see here is we get back this errors array. Now, we'll not get an error log because in the Network tab, we can clearly see that this has a 200 status code, and that is the default. But we can see, indeed, it failed on the backend, and we could now handle this. We could check if the errors object is present and then proceed appropriately on the front end. If I use a new email address, test2 here, which should not be taken, and I submit that, then we can see I get back this success response format. So that is all working. Now let's, of course, make sure that we can't just sign up, but also log in. And therefore, this button caption is wrong here, of course. On my Auth.js file, first of all, here we can actually switch to login. But I want to make sure that we can toggle between these modes anyways. So let's make sure this is something we can add. And for that, I'll add state here in this class. Let's add a new state object here, where I have isLogin, and that has a default value of true, let's say. Now, when I click this button here, so upon a click here, I want to have my, let's say, switch mode handler being executed, this switch mode handler, and therefore we should add such a method, maybe here. And in there, I basically want to revert my state. So we'll call this setState and use the function form here, which gives me my previous state. And then I can return a new state object. And there I will set isLogin equal to, well, what it was previously not. So the opposite of previous state is logged in, is logged in with that exclamation mark. I basically, revert this value. Now we can switch in state. Of course, we want to switch in our output here too, in our user interface. For example, here I don't want to say switch to login. Instead, I'll output a dynamic value here and say switch to. And then we check this state is login. And if this is true, then I want to be able to switch to the sign up, right? Because we are in login mode. So we would switch to sign up. And if we are not in login mode, then we are in sign up mode. So we would switch to login. So now we got this changed. And of course, when we submit the form, we also want to send different requests. Right now, we're sending this create user request. But if we are logging in, then we want to send a request to a different endpoint. We want to send a request to our login query. So that is the next thing which I'll add. So let's add a new request body variable now instead of a constant. And let's say our default is actually that we do log in, because we also have that set to true. So our default state is that we log in, not that we sign up. So now the request body for that default here will still have a query. But in that query command, basically, in that query string, I'll not send a mutation, but a query. And this can be confusing having that double query, but that here is a must-have, and that then depends on which endpoint you want to reach. So here I'll send a query, and I'll send that query to login. Remember, that is this endpoint here. Now login takes the email and the password as arguments. So here I will pass the email with double quotes and this injection syntax where I reference my email. And I will also pass my password with double quotes and that injection syntax here. And I want to get back some auth data, or I do get back some auth data, and I'm interested in actually all. Let's get user ID token and token expiration. So here user ID, token, and token expiration. That is what we can get from the backend, and that is what I want to get here. And now I'll just check if this state is login. If that is not true, because then I'll not be sending my login request, but my sign up request. So now I will move that request constructor here in there and just override request body. Because it is a variable now, I can change it if we're not sending a login request. And then we can use that same fetch call to that same backend with a different request body effectively. Now, with that, let's save this and let's have a look. First of all, this toggling seems to work. Now, we are in login mode now because we could switch to sign up. And now let's take credentials that maybe don't exist. And I get an error, failed. Let's have a look here. It's a 500 error. Password is incorrect. Okay, so that's good. Now let's go back and let's use valid credentials. And this looks better. And we get back our login object with the token expiration, which is 1 hour, and our user ID. So this is now working. We are able to log in and to sign up. Obviously, we're not doing anything with that token and so on the front end yet. That is something which will follow. But this is an important first step, being able to leverage our GraphQL API. Now we will build up on this in the next parts of this series. Hopefully, again, see you there. Bye.